Welcome to the first session of the Brain and Minds Day here on the second last day of this fabulously successful Festival of Ideas. We are gathered here today on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and it is only right that we acknowledge the elders past and present. And I hope you've noticed the bunjil nest at the top. Those of you who are now become regulars at the Festival of Ideas, you'll know all about the bunjil nest. But the idea is that you write a message and place a stick. And please leave your message up there. It's going to be a fabulous thing which will reach fruition tomorrow afternoon on the last session of this great festival. I'd also like to acknowledge Vice Chancellor, who's here today, walking the talk, Glyn Davis. Welcome back, Glyn. And the President and the Chair of the Festival of Ideas, Fiona Stanley. Now, please tweet. You're allowed to have your mobile phones on, but all the sounds off. And please feel free to tweet. The hashtag is UOMFOI. Rashada Kasim of Melbourne University Debating Society is going to interrupt me every so often to tell me what you've been tweeting. So tweet well, tweet often. And speaking of tweeting well, tweeting often, we're going to ask you to vote well and vote often at the end of the session, because this is a bit different. Again, for those of you who haven't been to one of these sessions before, the presenters are actually arguing a proposition. And they've got 10 minutes to argue that proposition. And at the end, and then we'll have a panel discussion so that you can test their propositions, and I'll have a go at it as well. And then after the panel discussion, there'll be a vote. And it'll be fairly obvious how you vote, but you will need your mobile phone on. And if you're over a certain age and have never texted, just ask the young person next to you and they'll tell you how. But you will need to do that thing called texting, which is now really old-fashioned. You must know how to do it. We've got three fabulous speakers for you this morning. The title, as you already know, is Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And we've got three speakers, and just for balance, they're all women, who are putting forward their propositions from the Venus perspective, which is a cloudy planet. Hopefully they'll show us through to transparency. And I'd like you to welcome our first speaker, who's Associate Professor Cordelia Fine, from both the Melbourne Business School and the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. As a future fellow in psychological sciences and is in the Centre for Ethical Leadership at the Melbourne Business School. Ethical Leadership, Melbourne Business School. Okay, we'll just roll with it. We'll give them the headlines this morning in The Age. But in fact, Cordelia is a cognitive neuroscientist, and her latest book is called Delusions of Gender, The Real Science Behind Sex Differences. And her talk is Intimate Relations, Sex, Science, and Society. Can't wait.
Chances are the young women in this room are every bit as educated, intelligent, and ambitious as the young men. Yet chances are, in 20 years, the men will have reached higher status in their careers. What, if anything, should we be doing about this? Should we be putting more time and resources into stemming the loss of female talent and potential from the realms of science, technology, arts, business? Or should we just recognise that women and men are, on average, intrinsically different, and that equality of opportunity doesn't necessarily lead to equality of outcome? Chances are, too, that the young men in this room will go on to spend less time with any children they have, and less time doing household chores. So again, what should we do? Should we demand that workplaces better accommodate and destigmatise the responsibilities of working fathers? Should we implement quotas dictating that by the year 2016, 40% of toilets must be scrubbed by men? Or are women simply better suited to caregiving roles and men to breadwinning? Now, science on its own can't give us the answers to these kinds of questions, but our scientific understandings of why these sex inequalities exist importantly shape the kinds of answers that we favour and consider. And in recent decades, with the growing impact of neuroimaging, claims about differences between male and female brains have enjoyed a lot of airtime in these popular debates. Now, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with looking to neuroscience to try to understand gender differences. There are average sex differences in behaviour, there are sex differences in vulnerabilities to various disorders, and these must have correlates in the brain. But for as long as there has been brain science, there has been what I've called neurosexism, which are neuroscientific claims that reinforce and legitimate old-fashioned gender stereotypes and roles in ways that are not scientifically justified. Now, there are relatively subtle versions of this in the scientific literature in the form of poor methodologies, untested assumptions, and premature conclusions. And from these scientific seeds grow the monstrous fictions of popular neurosexism, which is a subspecialty within the larger field of neurononsense. It's hard to exaggerate how badly popular accounts misrepresent the state of the science of gender. Take, for instance, the recent book Work With Me, co-authored by John Mars of Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus fame, and Barbara Annis, and recently respectfully reviewed in The Economist. Like many books of this genre targeted to a business audience, Work With Me asserts that the key to female advancement lies in appreciating that females have a hardwired talent for communality, collaboration, intuition, and empathy that provide the perfect balance to men's intrinsically analytic, competitive, goal-oriented, and sometimes socially insensitive approach. Now, as attentive followers of the gender debates will notice, an identically flattering view of women has often been used to explain and justify sex inequality in the workplace, rather than to offer insights into how to turn it around. Different brains and hormones give rise to intrinsically different natures, and there are no prizes for guessing which nature is thought to be more suited to high-level careers and which nature to home life. Perhaps less obvious to the casual observer is just how profoundly a Mars versus Venus representation of the sexes conflicts with decades of behavioural research and the real state of knowledge about sex differences in the brain. Now, we're all aware that men and women aren't identical, but as Janet Hyde has demonstrated, 78% of sex differences in traits, abilities, and attitudes are surprisingly small, with so much overlap that if you were to use someone's biological sex to try to guess whether their behaviour was feminine or masculine, you would at best score 7% above chance. Now, in case you're wondering whether the largest sex differences can explain inequality in your workplace, the answer is that that really depends on whether physical aggression, attitudes towards casual sex, throwing velocity and distance, or frequency of masturbation are relevant to your organisation's KPIs. A second important caveat is that gender isn't a one-dimensional continuum that goes from very masculine to very feminine. Instead, it's more like a pick and mix. Each one of you is an unpredictable constellation of masculine and feminine traits. And these traits are not necessarily stable across time and place. We tend to be flexibly responsive to the social demands and expectations of a situation, including those relating to gender norms, and we adjust our behaviour accordingly, often unconsciously. This messy complexity of gender differences creates serious problems for the very idea of a male and female brain, as the neuroscientist Daphne Uell has pointed out. Given the considerable similarity between women and men, and that each individual is a complex and dynamic mix of masculine and feminine traits, what exactly is a female or a male brain? Who in this audience would we expect to have one? So perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that neuroscience has identified remarkably few reliable and uncontroversial sex differences in the brain, well, not through want of trying, and none that have been causally linked to psychological differences. The fact is, we're at the very beginning of the scientific journey of understanding how the neural circuits of the brain make up the complexities of the mind. And we just don't know what it means psychologically for, say, the amygdala to activate a bit more, or for the inferior parietal cortex to be a little plumper than average. Yet the popular books tell us with great confidence that brain scan studies show what we've always secretly suspected, that males and females are fundamentally different, from different planets. Now, from comprehensive inspection of these materials, I can inform you that the female brain of popular literature is a curious phenomenon. On the one hand, it can perform the remarkable feat of knowing what a man is thinking before he even thinks it. But on the other hand, its structure is random and haphazard, and its neural characteristics are such that it has trouble getting to the point in meetings. The male brain is a no less fascinating mixed bag. It is logical, with a primitive fascination with mathematics, but its neuroanatomy hinders the perception of dust, and its highly localized processing style makes it 25% less likely to connect emotions to language, which is presumably why there are no great male authors, And this localised structure also blocks it from remembering to perform tedious chores. If there were to be a prize for the most egregious abuse of neuroscience in the service of gender stereotypes, the competition would be intense. Alongside these unhelpfully blithe inaccuracies, popular claims are also implicitly based on scientific ideas from the previous century. Assumptions that brain circuitry is largely fixed by a genetic blueprint, and that there is a unidirectional causal pathway from genes to behaviour via hormones and brains. Yet it is now known that the functional and even structural organisation of the human nervous system is a continuous and dynamic process that continues throughout life. In the brain does not mean innate. And a growing body of research from behavioural endocrinology shows that what you do, what others do, and important cues in the environment can all affect hormonal state. Take, for instance, a large-scale longitudinal study which found that fatherhood reduces testosterone levels, and more so in fathers who spend more time caring for their babies. This complemented findings from a comparison of two neighbouring cultural groups in Tanzania, which found lower testosterone levels among fathers from the population in which paternal care was a cultural norm, compared from fathers from the group in which paternal care was typically absent. These studies show how the social construction of the father's role changes hormones and turns upside down the popular assumption that fathers don't do much baby care because of their hormones. This is a single example of the insight that gender as a social phenomenon shapes not only institutions, relationships, cognition, and perception, but also the brain and endocrine system. Continuing scientific research that works from this understanding can potentially challenge scientifically unjustified popular understandings of the contemporary gender status quo as fixed, inevitable, and ordained by nature. So if you care about sex equality, then you should care about popular understanding of sex and science. Yet we are currently so casual about the treatment of this topic that you can actually write more or less any drivel you like about male and female brains, and if you're lucky, you can enjoy the pleasure of seeing it quoted uncritically in a reputable newspaper, becoming a bestseller, bringing about sex-segregated teaching in schools, or being sold as a diversity training tool to a large corporation. The intentions may be benevolent, and often are, but claims that the sexes have inherently different brains and therefore inherently different natures increases the acceptance of both sexism and the status quo. And this is key. Neurosexism is only a small part of the many complex, interacting, mutually reinforcing factors that contribute to sex inequality. But neurosexism stifles the sense of possibility for progress that lies at the heart of every effort, individual and collective, to create a society in which the young women and men in this room will share more equally the pleasures and powers of public and private life. We all deserve better than that. Thank you.
Okay, you're all neurofeminists now. Men, can you feel your testosterone shriveling as the speeches go by? Let's see how we go with the rest of the presentations and the propositions you're going to hear today. The next comes from Professor Jayashri Kulkarni, who's director of the Monash Alfred Psychiatry Research Centre. Jayashri is an international authority in women's mental health and has pioneered research in many different areas, in particular in the area of treating women with schizophrenia with estrogen. There's an interesting phenomenon that women tend to develop schizophrenia differently from men, and there may be a relationship with estrogen, and Jayashri has looked at that research and explored that and many other areas as well. Please welcome Jayashri.
Lisa pulled the doona cover up over her head. She was trying to drown out the voice of her mother screaming in the next room and her mother's new boyfriend, Dave, who was yelling obscenities back at her. They had ruined her 10th birthday today. The voices got louder. Her mother's voice got shriller and louder, and suddenly there was a thud and it all went quiet. Lisa pulled her head out from under the doona, and as she did so, the door of her bedroom banged open. She could smell the alcohol on Dave's breath before she sensed him in the room. She felt sick, she felt scared as he walked towards her and got into her bed. 8 years later, Lisa found herself at the age of 18 in an emergency department in a metropolitan Melbourne hospital again. She was trying to explain to the unsympathetic and cold nurse that yes, the slashes on her arms and her wrists had been self-inflicted and they had been done with a vegetable knife. She tried to explain to the junior doctor that she did this because she felt numb, she felt dead inside. In fact, the only time she felt anything was when she could see the blood flowing, and that gave her a sense of being alive. For a long time, Lisa hadn't felt any emotions other than the volcanic anger that erupted in her, that she didn't know what to do with, and hence she would actually harm herself. She had great problems feeling like a whole human being. She often felt like she was an actor in a videotape. She would look at herself in a mirror and she wouldn't know who was looking back at her. She felt fragmented, had no sense of herself. At school, she'd had great problems with trying to remember things. In fact, there were big chunks of her life that had just disappeared. She couldn't grasp the concepts of the subjects that the teachers were trying to teach her. She was very unpopular, and at 18, she weighed 100 kilograms, and she knew this was a terrible health problem for herself. Yes, she continued to self-harm. Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa would have a classic diagnosis of a stupid term, borderline personality disorder. It is better conceptualised as post-traumatic stress disorder chronic. And alongside this is often an overwhelming depression, as such as Lisa had experienced, that doesn't respond to antidepressants. Women in our community and many communities around the world have a greater prevalence of depression. In fact, it is twice as much depression in women than men. Women also experience twice as much anxiety disorder as men. And borderline personality disorder is almost universally diagnosed in women, not so much in men. So why are there these gender differences in the prevalence and, of course, in the treatment of mental illness? Women do receive the most psychotropic medications. We can look at this from two big domains. One is environment and one is biology. And the interaction, of course, is very, very prevalent, backwards and forwards, between environment and biology. When we look at environment, as I've mentioned in Lisa's case, and unfortunately Lisa's case is true and very prevalent, we can see that violence plays a role. In 2006, the Australian Bureau of Statistics carried out a personal safety survey of 16,400 Australians. 30% of the women surveyed had experienced physical assaults in the 12 months prior. 20%, 1 in 5 women, had experienced sexual assault in the 12 months prior. And 15% of the women surveyed were still living in violent relationships. When we look at violence in other situations, the violence in pregnant women, antenatal violence, has been documented in 14,451 women in a UK study called the Avon study that has been following up children since the 1990s. And there's a very great incidence of relationship between violence in a pregnant woman, done to a pregnant woman, and the impact that it has on poorer learning and poorer behaviour in her child up to the age of 4 and beyond. There is also a greater incidence of postnatal depression in women who experience violence during pregnancy. How then does all of this external violence translate into mental illness in women? Well, There are neurochemical mediators and there are neurohormonal mediators. And one of the biggest neurohormonal mediators is cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It is increased in production when people are stressed. And what has been found is that as the cortisol levels become higher, there is an impact on brain circuitry. There is even an impact on hippocampal volume, and there is a decrease in verbal memory capacity. There is a decreased capacity for new learning. And of course, when cortisol levels increasingly are increased in a more chronic sense, as in the case of ongoing abuse, there is a worsening outcome in terms of new learning and memory. Why are cortisol changes more significant in women? Well, there is a great interplay between sex hormone binding globulin, estrogen, progesterone, the sex hormones of the pituitary, and cortisol. And the net result of that is that women are more sensitive to cortisol changes and hence are more likely with stress to develop conditions such as the so-called borderline personality disorder, depression, anxiety. The story gets actually even worse because in the antenatal situation, a violent situation or stresses that the pregnant woman faces is in fact transmitted into increased cortisol in the developing fetus, which then has an impact on fetal development and then subsequent child and onward new learning, plus also behavioural problems with rage, impulse, self-harm, and so on. And to add to the worsening part of this is that that can actually be incorporated, the cortisol changes can be incorporated into serotonin gene transporter mechanisms, which then means that there can be a transmission of a genetic vulnerability to depression in subsequent fetuses and subsequent generations. Now, as the previous speaker has said quite correctly, we have it in our hands to do something about this. And I am concerned that the violence that we're seeing in our community is actually worsening, and that if we don't stop the violence that we're seeing happening, if we don't actually intervene, particularly in so many situations that we have opportunity antenatally and so on, if we're not able to actually do this, we are sitting on an epidemic of borderline personality disorder, depression, anxiety in women. There are many opportunities that we have in our society to actually improve women's mental health. We need to actually better understand the role of violence. We need to better understand the roles of gender roles, of the psychology of women, and we need to actually employ all this to actually come up with gender-tailored treatments that best suit women, so that we can prevent an ongoing epidemic of mental illness in women. Thank you.
Thanks, Jashri. Remember to tweet, #UOMFOI. Rashada will bring me up to date with what you're saying in a moment or two when we start the panel discussion. Our next presenter is Kim Cornish, who's Professor and Head of the School of Psychology and Psychiatry at Monash University. You can see that the University of Melbourne is an equal opportunity university. Kim's a developmental cognitive neuroscientist, particularly interested in genetic neurodevelopmental disorders such as Fragile X, autism, Williams syndrome, and others. Fragile X, the research into Fragile X has suggested to all the women in this audience that, in fact, intelligence is carried on the X chromosome, which you've always known, and we men have always known too, but that might contradict what Cordelia is arguing, so we'll just test that a little bit later. Kim is going to talk about how gender matters for the social brain.
Hello, hi. I was born in 1967 in a very working class, small town in a place called Bury in Lancashire. Okay. Both my parents were, my mum was a stay-at-home mum, and my dad had a manual factory job. All my growing up years, from being a child all the way through to being the first one in my family to go to university, to be the first one really in the school that I went to go on to university, was full of stereotypes of what men and women can do. Men can go on and be these great individuals who have great mathematical, analytical skills, can actually really do hard work jobs. And women, well, in my generation of women, in my small town in Lancashire, you might go and work at the factory nearby, but then you'd have kids. You'd have kids when you're about 18, 17, and that would be how it is, and so it goes on. Now, I have a 15, 16-year-old daughter. She is experiencing the same stereotypes in the same way, but perhaps more subtle than I experienced when I was also that age. And that's here in Melbourne in one of our public schools. So I want to talk today about and convince you that gender differences is not about having a Y chromosome. Oops. Male and female brains are extremely complex. And unlike Cordelia, and I'm sure you do believe in some of the research on brain imaging, there are some great studies now out there telling us that what we assumed would be differences in brain levels, particularly when it comes to language and empathy in females, that the interconnectedness is more dense in females than it is in males, is actually now not true. That development itself plays a difference, and that adult brains, by adulthood, those brains are far more interconnected than in childhood. But we live in a world where we still have stereotypes of women being empathetic, women really being able to communicate well, socially communicate, and men are all about analytical thinking, all about math and mathematical scientific processing. And we still have that silly stereotype in the middle where we have visual spatial skills and women are evidently not formed at all. So, what changes it? As I said, it had been previously assumed that brain regions specific to language were more dense or more interconnected in women. We know that this is now not the case, and also that the brain is somewhat gradually more specialised as you move into adulthood, whether you're male or female. Current research has begun to dispute the beliefs that you see here, that rearing and stereotypes make a man and a woman. That environment, I'm going to argue, is absolutely critical, along with a very complex interaction of genes. I'd like to argue that some new fascinating research has begun to show that early experiences at the gene level, and in particular hormones in utero, can modify regulatory factors affecting gene expression in such a way that although DNA sequence itself is not changed, physiology and behaviour is substantially influenced. So the brain itself can be affected by these regulatory factors and can be moulded to ultimately produce a masculine or feminine brain, regardless of biological sex, male or female. So gender traits such as social communication, clothes preferences, careers, and so on may be shaped by rearing and experiences way more than, say, biological sex can be, and they can be maintained by gender stereotypes. In my world, we look at developmental development itself to understand how changes in brain levels between males and females can impact on behaviour, and looking through the lens of children with specific genetic neurodevelopmental disorders as proven to have greater insight into the very complex world of genes and brain differences. You see here two types of developmental disorders that have formed the basis of much of my work over the last 2 decades. Williams syndrome, to the left there, is a syndrome that is caused by the deletion of about 25 genes on chromosome number 7. These children are hypersocial, so if you've ever met a child with Williams syndrome, they will come up to you, no matter what age they are, to hug you, to want you to talk to them, to look at them, to be with them. Okay, they are what we call hypersociable children. And that's your deletion of genes on chromosome 7. On the X chromosome is Fragile X syndrome. Fragile X syndrome is one of the world's leading causes or genetic origins of autism. Children, both male and female, are impacted quite differently in terms of their phenotypes and their social behaviours. But most children with Fragile X, be it male or female, have social aloofness, have all the characteristics we associate with autism. And that's the loss of a single gene on the X chromosome. So it's so very complex, trying to understand how the brain changes in terms of social behaviour between males and females, because in both these two developmental disorders, one produces hypersociability, one produces social aloofness, and both have differential changes at the brain level because of the impact of those genes. So to conclude, I think and I believe that the environment plays a very intrinsic role, and the new research on epigenetics allowing us to look and see how changes at the DNA level can impact our behaviour are fascinating. And add that, into our greater understanding of gene-gene relationships, then I contest that the role of genes and environment challenges the ideas that brain and behaviour differences are a simple product of the Y chromosome. Instead, we need to look at how we see brain differences in males and females and how they are protracted across the lifespan and across different genders. So, thank you.
Please welcome our speakers back up onto the stage for our panel discussion. So Kim, Cordelia and Jashri. And apologies for calling Kim Cordelia earlier on. And we have, just for a bit of balance, a bloke coming up who's Ben McKenzie, comedian well known for his satire in terms of being both a geek and a scientist. Please welcome Ben. And the way this works is we're trying to test you're going to eventually vote on what you think is the highest, not necessarily the best put proposition, but the highest priority proposition in terms of moving forward. Ben, are you feeling somewhat diminished as a result of this conversation?
No, not at all. I feel very comfortable in my decision to be a feminist, actually. It's been reaffirmed scientifically, which I think is brilliant. But I think the thing that I got out of all three talks is that men are from Earth and women are from Earth.
Right.
We're actually very similar.
An astronomical comment. Cordelia, you're putting forward, if you like, an institutionalization of neurosexism, and the extent to which that is changing, the extent to which, or it's just superficial, when you look at the world of business and you look at entrenched attitudes towards men and women, how entrenched do you believe that sexism based on a misguided belief of biology exists?
Look, I think it's certainly not ubiquitous, but, you know, casually, these are ideas that you encounter a great deal, and certainly when you look at surveys, there are certainly you know, large proportions of the population, which includes at the, you know, highly educated level, that do believe that there are intrinsic differences between the sexes. And I think when you start to talk about things like quotas, for example.
How appropriate.
No, you have to remember the beneficial effects of feminism on that side of things, Norman, thank you. Should be, that's better, that's appropriate, that's appropriate. As I was saying. What was I saying?
Well,
yeah, for example, if you think about things like quotas, these kinds of ideas, it comes down to these core ideas about men and women. So if you think that, look, women are just naturally less ambitious, less competitive than men, more interested in home life, feel their sacrifices are less worthwhile, then quotas are not going to seem like a good idea for you, because it just doesn't seem to make sense to try and get equality. Whereas if you think that actually we're kind of all born more or less the same, and that we're wasting a lot of female talent by these women just dropping away at every level, then quotas, you know, there are lots of other issues as well, but they're going to seem like more of a good idea. So I think that's why these ideas about men and women and what they're like, which neurosexism very much influence, really come to the core of so many questions about equality.
But Josh, doesn't your research really contradict a lot of what Cordelia's saying? I mean, you have found significant sex differences. I mean, something as profound as schizophrenia being so different, yep. I mean, there must be inherently very different brains with men and women.
Well, basically, the work that we've done is to look at the impact of estrogen as a sex hormone, modulating the neurochemistry. So the difference is the levels of estrogen. So it's actually that in male and female brains, the hormone has the same impact, but then it becomes the expression of the quantities and the timing of impact and so on. So it's kind of a bit contradictory, but on the other hand, I totally agree with the plasticity side of things, which is what both speakers have spoken about, that while there is an effect, it is modulating. It is able to be modulated.
So if there is this plasticity, and if it is true, as you said, that something as profound as borderline personality disorder is moulded into the brain rather than pre-wired in a sense, why is it so difficult to reverse?
Because I think that the situation that we have, and I'm speaking as a clinician, I see this all the time, is that we are losing, you know, very fine young women because of the ongoing social problems of domestic violence or interpersonal violence and so on. You know, and the sexualisation of children is the other side of this too, because there's this social concept of, you know, sexual violence. And so we are not removing that environmental influence, so we're not allowing.
So the magnitude of the trauma is so great
yep.
that you get such a profound
yep.
change.
Yep. And it is an ongoing trauma.
Kim, where do you stand or sit when it comes to this issue of intelligence being on the X chromosome, given that a lot of your research is into the X chromosome and the deficits there, which affect men more than women?
I think it's an anomaly to think that. When I look at Fragile X syndrome and we look at the gene itself, which is expanded considerably to produce intellectual delay, when we also look at the medium expansion that some of us will have, then we find that we have just normal intelligence, but with other aspects, in particular depression in women, in women who carry the Fragile X gene. So I think intelligence is just more than a gene. I think when you look at developmental disorders, the whole spectrum across many different chromosomes, you see that intelligence can be defected in the same way. So you can have William's child that I showed earlier, who will have intellectual delay and have nothing wrong with their X chromosome. So I think we need to be a bit cautious about making statements like that.
Questions or comments from you, please raise your hand and I'll bring you into the conversation as we go along. Yes?
I'm confused about something.
We'll just get a microphone to you because we are filming this.
I'm trying to understand something about which I'm currently confused, so if I throw that at you, I hope you can do something with it. On the one hand,
very modern of you to admit confusion, so thank you for that.
On the one hand, I understand that Asperger's and autism, I was not here to hear Kathy that's yesterday, but I understand that that is an essentially male phenomenon. It is that this strange, significant and very painful and sad phenomenon is essentially only linked with males. I also understand that, or I'm trying to understand, the work of Professor Sacha Cohen on both autism and empathy. And the notion of empathy as a thing that one might associate with either masculine or feminine characteristics is one that I'm also trying to link. And I wonder if I throw that uncertainty at you, if you can do something with it.
Kim?
Oh my goodness.
Can I ask a sort of a follow-up question? Because I've heard that autism and particularly Asperger's may not actually be primarily a male syndrome or problem.
No, I agree with that.
But in fact that because women are socialised from a very early age to be social, because that's the gender stereotype, that they learn to hide it better and so are never diagnosed. Is that a possibility?
Yes, I agree. And also the diagnosis of Asperger's autism is not as prevalent in females as it is in males, but it's nonetheless a significant number of women will have Asperger's and high-functioning autism. And I think you're absolutely right when you talk about the fact that you've got women who learn very quickly to how to cope in social situations and how to stay behind the scenes. Whereas in males, in the same way with ADHD, you get more upfront behaviour that is anomalous. And therefore, I mean, I would not say that it's male syndrome at all, but not sure how to answer the empathy question.
If I might add there. So there's this idea that autism is a sort of manifestation of the extreme male brain, and that's why that there is a high proportion of people with that diagnosis are indeed male, and there may be issues to do with diagnosis and treatment and so on. But I think what's important to this actually relates to the question that Joshua was responding to. Is so one issue is that one of the core impairments in those autism spectrum disorders is to do with the difficulty in understanding what other people are thinking and feeling. Now, this is sort of stereotypically seen as being a female strength and a male weakness. And if you give people questionnaires saying, you know, how good are you at working out what other people are thinking and feeling? Can you tell if somebody wants to enter a conversation? You do indeed find that women score better than men. However, quite a large body of research shows that how good people think they are at working out what other people are thinking and feeling, there's almost no relationship whatsoever to how good they actually are at thinking and feeling. And when you do an actual test of how good people are in this test, and this is work by William Ickes in Texas, you find that men and women are essentially identical at this task. And so this characterisation of autism as being an extreme male brain actually doesn't fit with what we know about the neurotypical population in terms of the capacity at that particular part of empathy. And that's why I think we have to be careful. For example, there certainly are differences, and for example, in the manifestation of schizophrenia and the treatments and the causes and things like that. But we can't make these sort of leaps from those kinds of situations to what are we saying about the population in general. There certainly must be some sort of neurological reason why males are more vulnerable to these kinds of developmental disorders if that's the case, but we shouldn't leap from there to saying these characteristics of these disorders must be different in the population generally between males and females.
That's a great point.
Kim, I'll come to this question about, Kim, you mentioned the lifespan and development through the lifespan. I just wonder, take a comment from all of you on this, is what role does adolescence have in reinforcing either these stereotypes or reinforcing behaviours in between the genders? Because that's a time when we prune our nerves, and our nerves, the connections in our brains become narrowed in a sense and more efficient. What role does adolescence play in all this?
Gosh, it's not actually my area of expertise. I can only go from the role of my two teenagers on this. And I think environment plays a massive role in it. I think all of us would agree here that stereotypes, if they're not there in early childhood, in the playground or in the street, then they are very much in place by about 11 or 12. Cognitive skills, particularly what's called executive functioning, which is this umbrella term for a whole range of skills like working memory.
Absent in adolescence.
It's still not there in adolescence, and it actually doesn't really consolidate itself until the late teens and early 20s, and in some cases, not at all. So I think...
Comedians.
I think the environment... Just to conclude, sorry, unless you said, I think that the environment has probably its most critical role then, and I think that's where society could begin to acknowledge that that's when it happens and begin to change before you get consolidated into these stereotypes by 15.
In schizophrenia, schizophrenia is a post-pubertal disorder. You don't have schizophrenia as the full-blown illness in children. You can have variants, but it's not the full-blown schizophrenia until the person is post-pubertal. And there are certainly a lot of evidence to back up the concept or the theories that what happens with puberty is you have a massive rise in all of the gonadal hormones as well as the pituitary precursors to those gonadal hormones. And in particular in women or girls, the circulating estradiol levels have a protective effect in that they actually down-regulate the key neurotransmitters of dopamine and serotonin, which are the ones that are implicated in developing schizophrenia. And this is behind why we see the first episode of schizophrenia in younger boys, so that the peak onset is between 16 and 19, whereas in women, the peak onset first episode is between, say, 22 and beyond, up to 25. So there is a gender difference in the age of onset, and there is a role that the particular mix of the puberty hormones have to play in that particular time, because the hormones do impact on cortical circuitry and also brain structure. So there's quite a lot of impact around puberty.
So Ben, are you beyond this developmental phase yet?
No, comedians never move beyond that developmental phase. We're always learning to be childish and adolescent, frankly.
Never pruned.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question directed toward Yashira. You mentioned the need to stop violence in the community because that often gets directed.
Small task.
Yeah. No, it is a big task, and I completely agree with you. And unfortunately, that violence is often directed more at women than it is at men or just males in general. But I'd like to, as an anthropologist, a critical anthropologist if you wish, look a bit upstream, because if you look at the world that we live in, it is a very violent world. And I might start with the business world. And Cordelia, I'd be interested in getting your comments on this because you teach in a business school. But as I look around the world, it is the multinational corporations that are making and breaking governments and politicians. We've certainly seen that in Australia with the mining industry.
I'll ask you to shorten this.
Hold on, I'll be through in a minute. But also, Michael Clare talks about the resource wars. So you've all heard about the war in Iraq as being described as the war for oil. So again, there are other factors involved, but it seems to me that our economic system and the business community is perpetuating a lot of that violence that often is taken out ultimately on women.
So a Marxist-Leninist interpretation of violence, Cordelia?
Look, I think there are a few, to bring it back to the issues about gender. I think when you're talking about the individual level and you're talking about violence against women and the sorts of the situation that was being described that's leading to these mental disorders, a lot of that has to do with lack of power to leave a situation, to have the economic independence to leave. And when you look at the factors influencing rates of domestic abuse, discrepancy in income is a large one. So I think, you know, greater sex equality in the public sphere isn't just about, you know, the contribution that women are still not making as much as I believe they could in the realms of science and technology and business and so on and so forth, but it's actually to do with individual power within relationships. And I actually think that improving the status and economic power of women will do a great deal to actually address some of the issues that Dr. Kulkarni was talking about. Now, at a larger level, I think there is an issue, and I'm sorry this is not going to address your point in any kind of sophisticated way, but I think part of the problem is that because women are lower status, those sort of traditionally feminine traits are seen as lower status and they are denigrated. So being a feminist isn't about trying to make everyone like men, it's actually trying to make everyone take from sort of both sides the best of the masculine and feminine spectrum. And I think as long as men are higher status in organisations, those sort of stereotypically feminine traits of empathy and concern are going to be, unfortunately, less likely to come to the rise in any organisation, including business ones.
I'll come to Rashad in a moment just for the latest tweets, if you're ready. Yep. And then I'll come to Fiona. Joshie, you talked about stress being a profound factor influencing brain development. To what extent does stress affect men's brains too in terms of violence perpetration?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's not a specific gender effect, but what I was trying to get across is that, in fact, the vulnerability in terms of the impact of cortisol on particular brain circuitry or particular structures like the hippocampus, there is a greater propensity for women to have those changes at a lower level of stress.
So whilst I flippantly said a Marxist-Leninist interpretation, to what extent does economic and social stress through deprivation create that environment?
It's a great deal of, that does set the scene for a great deal of discrepancy. The other thing that I would add is in terms of thinking about the violence, particularly towards younger girls, women, we do worry, and we're seeing this a lot in the clinics, and my paediatric colleagues are seeing it as well, is the sort of change in social fabric in that the single mother with many, many different partners, illicit drug and substance use sets the scene for the boundary violations that we're seeing much more of, which is really worrying. And then you add that to what I've alluded to, the sexualisation of children earlier in their developmental spectrum, and so that combination I think really does mean that there's a greater sexual violence that women are experiencing.
Rashada, what's happening in the Twitter sphere?
So comments from our followers at home. If we do find hard brain science of gender difference, should we silence it for the sake of equality and progress?
I don't think you ever silence science. Science is science, and what you find is what you find.
It's just making sure that it's good science.
That's true.
And I think that's what you were trying to say, Cordelia, in your talk. There's really poor quality science that comes under that very soft science label, and then there's really good hardcore science.
But even hardcore science can be prejudicial, depending on the hypothesis.
It can be, in it.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, just having a brain scanner doesn't make it good science.
No,
I don't think anyone, well, I'm sure nobody on this panel and people who make criticisms of the science are certainly not advocating censorship. It's actually just about looking at the quality of the science. And I think there's can be an unfortunate perception that science is objective and then criticism of it in this in this sort of realm is political. And I think that's clearly very misguided. Actually, the people who criticise this work are actually interested in better quality science.
So I think about how it's reported and presented to the public, because like you were saying, people can take any bit of science that they find in neuroscience and then write a book called Men Are Awesome and Women Are Less Awesome, and people will publish it and it will get on the front page of newspapers. Whereas if you have a neurological study that shows that in fact men and women have very similar brains,
it's not quite as exciting as
no one's going to publish
from my own book sales.
We failed to find a big difference between men and women's brains. Great, we won't put that on the front page of our newspaper. So I think that's a big part of it as well.
But the other implication here is that the structural discussion is kind of false, is that we live in this world where our genes can be changed without visible changes in our genes, the so-called epigenetics phenomenon and transmitted between generations, and our brains are bathed, as you're saying, Joshie, and in fact you're all saying, in hormones which change the way they function without seeing it on a scanner.
And of course the environment influences hormonal state and so on and so forth.
No, you can see it on a scanner.
Can you?
You can see it with PET scanning. You can actually look at the
because that's the
uptake
function
of
of the brain in action.
Yep.
Fiona.
Well, we need more women in neuroscience, but as long as they're not going to be too programmed to not be honest about the kind of work they're doing. But Kathy Lett, just a comment, Kathy Lett made a very humorous but quite good comment yesterday in relation to the glass ceiling. She said we get to the glass ceiling in the workplace with our bottle of Windex in our hand and cleaning it, and talked about the glass ceiling in the home. In other words, these gender disparities, and I think that was fun. And also we had one other very good comment from the group who were sort of putting in the Aboriginal and there's disparities there, saying that it's not just physical violence and sexual violence, it's also the psychological violence of the look and the denigrating, that kind of violence. So I think that's something that I want to... My question, however, relates to language development in children and the differences between males and females, which I thought were pretty well researched, that females in fact develop language on average, or if you look at the distribution, more earlier than males. So how much of this do we know is genetically or environmentally determined? And then the last question is about the Canadian couple bringing up their genderless child, which you might have read about. What's good and bad about that, and what's going to happen there?
So language, Kim?
Yeah, I think at the cognitive level, so at the level of how boys versus girls learn to read, how they learn to do academics in different ways is well established. Of course it is, and there's some beautiful work by Dorothy Bishop, who's based at Oxford, who talks about that, and really good science. At the brain level, this is where brain imaging is still a long way to go. You know, because what we're not finding clear gender differences in young boys and girls. We may find that a little bit later when the brain is actually specialised into its modules, but we can't quite track that yet in brain imaging, and that's why I think so much brain imaging is what you said. It's like neuro-nonsense. I think... Well,
this is the popular stuff. Yeah.
So at the cognitive level, yes. At the neuro level, at the neural and the brain level, not quite yet, no.
And the genderless child, Cordelia?
Well, actually, let's make a comment on the language case actually first, if that's all right. But I mean, because my understanding is that when you look at language development up to the age of about 5, there are sex differences. But actually, when you look at how much of the variance, so variability that explains, it's very small, it's about 2%, and then those differences tend to go away. And of course, when you get to the school level, you do find sort of sex differences in reading and so on and so forth. But again, so in the gender debate, it's always kind of like, oh, they have these little average differences here and these little average differences there. Actually, they're overwhelmed by socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage, it's worth pointing out. But who's winning the book prizes? Okay, it's some women, but it's predominantly men. And so I think, we can't start using these average differences that we may or may not see, whatever their causes, and saying, well, that explains why, we don't have as many women in high-level scientific careers, for example. Let's look at the mental rotation or whatever it is. So, even these small average differences, as the case of male success in the literary field, shows that, how important actually are these small cognitive differences. The genderless child, if I might zoom on to that now, look, I think that's a really fascinating issue. I mean, I think everyone who's a feminist and has children has that tension and ethical dilemmas of wanting to raise your children in a sort of feminist egalitarian way, but at the same time realising that your child has to get on in the world in the way that it is, and wanting to not have them be bullied or teased at school. But I think what was most interesting about that case, and I have to say, having listened to an interview with those parents, the way that they tried to give the child skills and tools to able to deal with the reactions that they would get was really remarkable. It was some really quite inspiring parenting. But I think what was most interesting about that case was the reaction, the furious reaction of many people commenting on that case, and I think it shows how important gender is to us. And you see that same fury with the idea of, giving boys dolls or dressing them in pink. you know, if you truly believe in that sort of deep inner gendered core, why would it trouble you? It will will out over this, you know, silly egalitarian parenting. But I think those are reactions as a society to those kinds of cases of people trying to push at those gender boundaries are actually really fascinating.
I keep on, while you're thinking about which is your highest priority, I remember, I think it was Paula Toynbee writing in The Guardian, was describing how she'd brought up her son to be, you know, a feminist and had really, you know, thought about that a long time, and she was really struggling with it. And then one Christmas, I think she was in Harrods, and asked him when he was about 4 what present he wanted, and he pointed at the hairdressing set. And she thought, I've won, I've got it. And so Christmas Day comes and he opens up the hairdressing set, pulls out the hairdryer and goes, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat.
Yeah.
Which is the highest priority for you, Ben?
For me, well, look, they're all really. I think we should do them all. Can we just do them all?
Yeah,
let's do them all. But I know. I mean, I have known a lot of people. It's no secret that depression is very common amongst comedians. It's probably why we seek to be funny. As some sort of coping mechanism, and I've seen firsthand.
Would you like to lie down and we'll have a conversation?
Yeah, let's do. I'll talk about my parents, and but yeah, I think it's such a destructive force that I think I would probably have to put that as my highest priority.
So make your vote by texting to those numbers, and or you can also register with the website that was on the previous slide, or it's there as well, and you can submit your votes via that website.
I was just going to ask too, that the thing that occurs to me is that obviously, you know, as you brought up, the influences that you have and the environment that you're in has a change on neurology. So when you're doing all this testing to see if there are differences between men and women in their brain makeup, you don't know if those differences were always there, if they've been caused by the life that those people have led. Because unless we can find like a man and a woman who've been raised by wolves with no sort of gender preconceptions about how humans should be.
It is the uncontrollable. I mean, the other side of it is, you know, we're talking about I see women who have got stories of the horrific stresses, but there are many other unspoken stresses that you know, their mothers may have experienced when they were pregnant that we will not know about. There are the sort of broader cultural stresses. You know, for many of our Indigenous women, there is a whole feeling of being oppressed and suppressed, and so you know, it's very, very difficult to measure what is going on in that sort of situation. But it has an effect, an impact.
But also now we're finding that we don't know what the impact is in utero, you know, in terms of how traumatic events are for the family, for the mother, and how that impacts on cognition and brain development of the fetus, irrespective of the genes.
Can I just interrupt a second? 20 seconds to go to make your vote. Neck and neck race here. It's a Melbourne Cup final here between Jeshri and Cordelia. Carrie, sorry, what were you going to say, Kim? I interrupted you halfway through there in a typical male way.
I was saying that it isn't even a case that we can look at how stress impacts from childhood. It's still going to impact now from traumatic events in the life of the mother or traumatic events from generations before. So it's so complex, so complex.
Can I add on this point? This is actually an example of one of the subtle versions of neurosexism in the scientific literature, which is that, of course, every neuroscientist understands that the brain is the product of genes, hormones, experience, all sort of interacting in this very complex way that Kim has to grapple with daily. But when you actually look at the scientific research looking at sex differences, none of it, or almost none of it, is looking at trying to understand how the gendered world, how gendered experiences influence, how gender becomes incorporated into our cerebral biology. Rather, they're simple comparisons of males and females. Now, that doesn't mean that the neuroscientists think that there is some sort of fixed male-female neural signature, but it does mean that they can't produce any data that can actually challenge that assumption. So this is a very subtle way in which the neuroscientific data itself is contributing in very small ways. Because if you imagine if the literature was full of data that said, look, this is how this kind of gendered experience influences the brain, it would be much harder for the popular writers to persist with this idea that it's in the brain, it must be innate.
Please thank our fantastic panel for such a great session.